class. Welcome to week 6 of our studies in ethics. Today I want to go over a brief summary of what we've done thus far, and then I want to dive into an area of ethics known as virtue ethics, which traces its way back to the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, and which has enjoyed a bit of a revival in the 20th century. Thus far, we've looked at where ethics comes from. And we've talked specifically about theological ethics, despite the attempts of modern ethicists to avoid theology and not talk about God. We've seen that without God, it suddenly becomes difficult to account for where ethics comes from and how it is to be moderated in a way that everyone could subscribe to. The field of modern ethics is sort of a mess. There is very little unilateral agreement about what should or should not be the approach to ethical thought, despite the fact that when social debates arise, people chime in with great confidence, including the ethicists who know that their theories are not unilaterally agreed to. We looked at theological ethics, and then we looked at how in the 18th century, a couple of different alternatives to theological ethics or Christian ethics began to emerge. On the one hand, we had Immanuel Kant proclaiming that reason alone could develop a maxim, a proposition by which or to which all ethics could be held accountable. And his maxim he called the categorical imperative, the command that is applicable across the board. And remember, he said, the heart of all ethics boils down to the idea that every human being is worthy of dignity in and of themselves. None of us are a means to an end. Or, to put it another way, he would say, whatever you would do in a circumstance, only do it if you would universalize it and will everyone to do it in exactly the same kinds of circumstances. And that was his foundation of ethical thought based on what he said was reason alone. And we looked at some criticisms of that. Then we looked at an alternative to that, developed by someone who had no theological commitments at all. The suspicion is Kant was at least a little inclined towards a religious tradition. But in his same era, a man named Jeremy Bentham, who was explicitly an atheist, developed another alternative way of thinking about ethics called utilitarianism. And utilitarianism says that the ethical principle that should guide all thought is that we should maximize happiness throughout the world. That whatever we do, we should do whatever creates the most happiness in the world. And if we have to choose between two difficult circumstances, the one that makes the most people happy is worthwhile. And we also looked at some challenges to utilitarianism. Now, both of those types of ethical thinking are still working today. And in our ethical intuitions, both of those streams of thought still have an appeal. We still often think it wouldn't be fair or just to mistreat an individual, and yet it also seems wise to do what's best for the largest number of people. And so those ethical systems still exist today, and they're still in conflict with one another today. And that's where we've been thus far in this class. Now I want to look at a much older strain of ethical thought, which has now been revived most recently. And it is called virtue ethics. And it traces its way back to the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. Now, if you want a little Greek history, a lot of philosophy goes back to the ancient Greek world, which was sort of the birthplace of Western philosophy. And most prominent among the early Greek philosophers was a man named Socrates, who wandered around asking questions and exploring what knowledge is, and what virtue is, what is true and good and beautiful. And Socrates then took up a student in Athens, a young man named Plato. And Plato became one of the greatest philosophers of all of time. All of modern philosophy, in one way or another, traces its way back to questions that Plato first prompted. Plato then took under his wing a student who at 17 years old became a student named Aristotle. And Aristotle would become an equally great philosopher. In fact, a lot of philosophy is simply an ongoing dialogue between the school of Plato and the school of Aristotle. And Aristotle would then take up a student whose name was Alexander, who became Alexander the Great, who conquered a lot of the European world for Greece. And it is the reason why the New Testament in the Bible is written in Greek, because of it came in the wake of Alexander's conquest. But we're going to focus on Aristotle today and Aristotle's ethical thought. Briefly, Aristotle was born in around 384 BC and died in 322 BC, so lived perhaps around 62 years. And he went to Athens, Greece, at the age of 17 to study in Plato's renowned school. He was married and he had a daughter. That wife died and he married again and had more children, including a son, to whom he dedicates his ethical writings. At the age of 39, King Philip of Macedon hired him to tutor his then 13-year-old son, Alexander, who would become known as Alexander the Great, although Aristotle only tutored him for 2 or 3 years. So some people look at the horrific conquests of Alexander the Great and ask whether or not Aristotle's ethics were to blame. The truth is, Aristotle only had a limited time in which to influence Alexander, and it's far more likely that Alexander's primary influence was his father, who put Alexander in his military regime and taught him how to be a leader. At the time in ancient Greece, when someone was hired to be a tutor, it was an all-encompassing role. The word for tutor was pedagogos. And a pedagogos served in the place of the parents. The pedagogos followed the child around, protected the child, disciplined the child, and could punish the child even with corporal punishment, physical punishment, in order to keep the child in line and protect them. They were to raise the child up until they reached the age of adulthood, and then the pedagogos would step aside, and the now grown child would go on to be an adult. The goal of the pedagogos was to raise the child to be well-mannered in Greco-Roman society, Greek society, and in the wake of Greece's conquest, the Roman conquest, the pedagogos would continue to be a role that Romans would hire to shepherd their children in the hopes that their children would one day be Roman senators. So the pedagogos would teach them how to speak well in public and teach them ethical life and behavior. It was an all-encompassing kind of role. So there is still hot debate today about what kind of influence Aristotle might have had on Alexander. At 49, Aristotle, having wandered around the world a bit, moved back to Athens and started his own school named the Lyceum, which is dedicated to the god Apollo, the sun god. Aristotle set about a project of doing research as had never been done before. He researched botany, biology, logic, music, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, cosmology, physics, the history of philosophy, metaphysics, psychology, ethics, theology, rhetoric, political history, government and political theory, and the arts. And he went at it from the perspective of an empiricist. He wanted to collect information about the world. And he began to collect manuscripts of important works and arguably put together in Athens the first library of history, because he realized the importance of capturing a compendium of information that was all kept in one place for scholars to access. It would not be until in 19th century France, Diderot would compile an encyclopedia that someone would create essentially a new approach to the collection of information that Aristotle first began. And that uh, that gathering of information that was known as the encyclopedia, this revolutionary new move in information distribution, would be a stepping stone on its way to the internet and to Wikipedia, which is a collection of information like no other. But that traces its way, that instinct to collect information that people can access traces its way back to Aristotle. Let's talk about Aristotle's favorite topics of research and writing. Aristotle wrote one of the early treatises on logic. And in so doing, he came up with a structure of deductive logic known as the syllogism. And the syllogism is an argumentative structure in which premises lead to a conclusion. And if they hold together correctly, if they hold together logically, they create a valid argument. And the conclusion follows necessarily and unavoidably from the premises. And if the premises are also true and valid and tied together logically, not only is it a valid syllogism, it is sound, which means true premises tied together in a valid way lead necessarily to a true conclusion. So, for instance, a valid and sound syllogism would be: all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The premises are true, they're tied together logically, so they lead unavoidably to a conclusion that flows from the premises and is also true. And that is a syllogism. And Aristotle laid that out as the first demonstration of how deductive reasoning should work. So he went about the world collecting information as an empiricist, as one who wanted to study the world through the five senses and create just a log of all the information there was to have. He literally went around categorizing the plants that he saw in Athens. He was one of the first botanists. And from all the information that could be gathered, he then wanted to create a system by which logical conclusions could be deduced. So empiricism is a tangible, inductive kind of knowledge. You go around and look at the world and sum up what it is, and then deductively, logical conclusions could be drawn from that compendium of knowledge. He approached the world in terms of an epistemology that in our modern day would be described as naive realism. He took the senses to pretty well accurately reveal what the world was like, and he didn't spend a lot of time questioning that. And if you haven't studied the history of philosophy, that probably very easily makes sense to you. What you see and what you smell and what you hear and what you taste, that's pretty much how things are. That's called naive realism. If you have studied philosophy, you realize how problematic that is and how easily skepticism can undermine the basic intuitive epistemology with which Aristotle and modern scientists approached knowledge. In this way, Aristotle did lay down the groundwork for modern science. His approach was: you go out and you study the world, you figure out what it's like, and then you make a hypothesis perhaps about how things are, and then logically you can deduce conclusions from your theories about the world. And it's not exactly like the modern scientific method, but it was the groundwork for it. He was an early empiricist, and modern science is often empiricism of the naive realist form as well. Now, one thing that Aristotle wrote about, and he did this from the very early part of his writings and stuck to it throughout, and he did this without much explanation or defense. He simply said, this is how the world is. He divided the world into categories. And what he calls categories are things without combination. Things that are a pure and simple thing in and of themselves, not something made up of two separate things. And there are 10 of them. And he says this is the list of 10. There's not any more out there. This is the exhaustive list. And you can't reduce these. You have to have these 10. And here are the 10 categories into which everything fits. And as I say, he says this without much defense, and most people today would not agree that he could substantiate this, but this was how he approached the world and philosophy. The 10 categories are: there are substances, and a substance is a pure thing in and of itself. A man is a substance. A horse is a substance. There's nothing. If you cut a horse in half, you don't have a horse anymore. You have something less than a horse. So it's a whole and complete thing. It's a substance. 2, you have qualities, like the color white, or that something is grammatical. That is a quality of it. 3, you have quantities, like something is 2 meters long. 4, you have things that are in relation to other things that are relative, like something is double, or a person is a slave. That's a relation to some other person or some other thing. So relations are a category. Number 5, you have place. Right now you're sitting in a room, or you're sitting at a desk. That's a place. Number 6, you have time. You have yesterday, today, and tomorrow. That's a category. 7, you have positioning. And positioning has to do with, for instance, you are sitting or standing or lying down. It's how you are situated, or how a thing is situated. Then we have the quality of having. So for instance, I have shoes on is a quality of possession that describes me. 9, we have acting upon, so like cutting and burning. And 10 is being affected, such as being cut and being burnt. And those are the 10 categories that can describe all things. Those are the 10 essential standards and measurements by which everything can be evaluated and described. And those are the 10 categories. And Aristotle sticks to the categories throughout all of his writings. Now, modern philosophers have done away with this. No one thinks much about categories in this sense anymore. But it was an important contribution to the history of philosophy. And when you get to Thomas Aquinas, who in the 13th century was very devoted to Aristotle, you see Aquinas trying to import the idea of categories into Christian theology. Now, when we start to talk about Aristotle's ethics, and he wrote a book called the Nicomachean Ethics dedicated to his son. Nicomachean is a derivation of his son's name, so it's his son's ethics. Aristotle begins to talk about virtue. And virtue is a different category than most of us are used to thinking it. Virtue does not mean the modern Christian sense of good behavior, of holiness, of obedience to God, or even the secular versions of being very charitable or being very kind-hearted. Virtue means, in the Greek, it means excellence. And excellence in terms of living life exactly right. So there are different kinds of virtue for different kinds of people. A soldier's virtue is to be courageous and strong and to fight well. Whereas a baker's virtue is to cook well and produce sufficiently and run a good business. And so those are different virtues in the Aristotelian sense. Virtues mean living well and appropriately to your place in life. When Aristotle is pushed to define virtue, his definition is a little bit ambiguous. And most people today do not wholeheartedly embrace his definition of virtue, because he essentially would say it's to do the right thing in the right way at the right time for the right people to the right degree with the right motivations. And there's immediately we ask questions about how do we know what is the right way. But Aristotle doesn't ever actually solve that problem for us. So, for instance, a couple of quotes from his Ethics. He says, in talking about a virtuous person, he says, "The man then who faces and who fears the right things and from the right motive in the right way and from the right time and who feels confidence under the corresponding conditions is brave." So bravery is a virtue, but what is it exactly? Well, it's facing and fearing things, the right things, from the right motive, in the right way, at the right time. And so that's kind of how Aristotle hones in on virtue. He assumes we know what he means by saying right. Or again, another quote, he says, the man who is angry at the right things and with the right people, and further, as he ought, when he ought, as long as he ought, is to be praised. That raises all kinds of questions about how ought I to be angry, and at whom ought I to be angry. But Aristotle seems to assume these are intuitive and obvious. And in fact, virtue ethicists, when asked, how do we know the right way to live, or the right way to be brave, or the right way to be angry, virtue ethicists will tell us, well, do what a virtuous person would do, which simply begs the question of how do we know which ones are virtuous? And a virtue ethicist doesn't really, either in the ancient Aristotelian tradition or in the modern tradition, if you look at Philippa Foot and other ethicists who have taken up the school of virtue ethics, they tend to operate out of an intuitive stance. That a person who lives a full, happy, mature, productive life is in one way or another virtuous. And you can look around and see examples of that in society, and you just intuitively kind of know who's living a healthy, happy life. And that person, in one way or another, is virtuous. They are living with excellence, and you should do the same. The way Aristotle talked about this kind of excellence, this intuitive sense for life, was by using a couple of different concepts. One was a telos, and a telos is an end game, a design, a purpose. And your purpose in life is to be the best version of you can. And if you choose a career path, it's to be the best, most appropriate you in that career that you could be, as with soldiers and bakers. And he would say that's written into the human design, although not in a theological sense. He does not talk about God designing us to be in certain ways. He thinks it's just in the nature of a human being. So for instance, the telos of an acorn is an oak tree. And if an acorn is planted in good soil and watered and given sunlight and tended to, it will grow into exactly what its design tells it to grow into. It's an early form of genetic theory. Written in the acorn is a genetic code that tells it that it's to become an oak tree. And if everything is right in this acorn's life, it becomes an oak tree. And in the same way, human beings have a telos. We have an end or a goal, something we're supposed to become, an excellent, happy, healthy, functioning, productive adult. And if you live well, if you live virtuously, you will become your telos. So all of Aristotelian ethics revolve around this idea of a design and a process of maturing into your design. A second important Greek concept that comes into play when we talk about how are we to know what a virtuous person is like is the concept of eudaimonia. And eudaimonia is a word for happiness, but it's a fulfilled kind of happiness in which we live out our purposes, in which we do what we are designed to do. If you live into your telos, your design, you will reach eudaimonia, a feeling of happiness and contentment with who you are and where you are. A person who simply abuses drugs and experiences euphoria is not experiencing eudaimonia. Eudaimonia means the happiness and fulfillment that comes from knowing that you've lived well according to your telos, according to your design. So these are the Greek underpinnings of ethics. And Aristotle would say, in order to reach eudaimonia and fulfill your telos, you have to live virtuously. And that means living the right way, in the right time, with the right motives for the right people, and so on and so on. He says that a virtue is a mean, a middle ground between two vices. And living a virtuous life means finding the right balance between extremes so that we live well. So for instance, bravery, Aristotle will tell us, is a virtue. But too much bravery leads to rash and reckless behavior. And too little bravery is simply cowardice. And so the virtuous person living a virtuous life will find that mean, that middle ground between two extremes. And they will not be reckless and they will not be cowardly. They will be exactly the right amount of brave. And that can vary from person to person because a soldier's bravery is different than a baker's bravery. But the virtuous life is finding that right balance that points you in the direction towards your telos, your design, that allows you to experience eudaimonia. Aristotle will use an illustration that is picked up by modern virtue ethicists, and they say it's like an archer aiming an arrow at a target. An archer wants to fire a bow and arrow and shoot the arrow into the target, and the target is that happy, fulfilled, healthy life. And virtue is aiming in that direction and finding that exactly that right balance and tension that will point you in that direction. And if you had asked an archer how it works, an archer might not explain physics to you at all. They might tell you that it feels right. You know how it feels to aim correctly. And through a series of trials and errors, aiming at small things and achieving them or not achieving them, you learn how to aim at bigger things like life goals. And when you learn that balance, it feels right, and you know that you're living virtuously and directing your life towards telos and eudaimonia, and there's an intuition to it, there's a feel to it that tells you you're headed in the right direction. And that's generally the approach of virtue ethicists to approaching and resolving ethical issues. For the Christian, there's an important crossover here. So in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, John begins by describing the creation of the world. And he's alluding to the book of Genesis and the story of the creation of the world. But he writes into it a Greek word that the Greek philosophers were using in John's city, in the city of Ephesus. Because centuries before John, there was a philosopher named Heraclitus. And Heraclitus said that there is a foundational reason that gives order and sense and direction to everything. And he calls that the logos. From the word logos, we get the word logic today. There's a reason to everything. But the word logos is broader than just logic. There's a foundational structuring principle that gives everything a sort of order that has a reasonable, discernible purpose to it. And this is actually, this underlies Aristotle's approach to things, although Heraclitus would be the one who would name the logos as the foundation of the universe. The universe is founded on logos, which can be translated reason or word. Sometimes the word logos is translating word. In the Gospel of John, chapter 1, John says, in the beginning was the Word. And the Greek word for word, the Greek word for the English word, is logos. So what John says is, in the beginning was the logos. In the beginning was the foundation and ordering principle of all things. And Greeks living in Ephesus, Heraclitus lived in Ephesus, John lived in Ephesus. The Greeks there would have said, yes, we agree to that. In the beginning was the logos. We all agree to that. In the beginning was the logos. And the logos was God. And they would say, okay, we accept that the foundational principle was what you call God. Well, philosophers will buy into that. Greeks would certainly buy into that. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. And a Greek would be fascinated by the addition of the preposition. Now, what do you mean it was with God? Do you mean God controlled logos? Or was a partner to God? What are you saying there? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and nothing was made without him that has been made. And again, the Greeks would buy it absolutely. Everything was made through an ordering principle, and you could say it's in the mind of God or what have you. God controls the logos. This word was light, and light was life, the life of all mankind. This ordering principle inspired and guided humanity. And again, all the Greeks would say, yep, absolutely agree. This all makes sense. We're jiving with this. And then John will slowly unveil the idea that this logos that was at the beginning shaping things and bringing things into being and illuminating humanity's way actually came and was born as a human being, was incarnated as Jesus of Nazareth. And the Greeks already had stories of gods that became human beings and walked the earth. So again, this was not a surprising story to them. They would have absolutely listened to this without suspicion. But what John is doing is he's taking their philosophical foundations and saying, your philosophical foundations that we all agree to can be completed in the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And so he's trying to walk the Greeks into Christian theology by using their own concepts. And so if a Greek is saying, I want to live a virtuous, right life because I'm aiming at eudaimonia and I know I have a design that points me towards my telos, Paul would say, absolutely, or John would say, absolutely, that's correct. And the thing that gave you that ordering principle, that pointed you in the direction, that gave you a design of what you're to come, and that can make you completely fulfilled and happy, that principle is actually a sentient, thoughtful mind that exists in the Creator. And that Creator loves you so much that he was born among us to show us what a rightly lived human life looks like. Because Jesus was the only human being who lived without wrongdoing. Jesus never did wrong, the scriptures say. And so Jesus became the living example of a person who, with complete, perfect virtue, aimed at their telos and reached it, fulfilled their purpose, and reached eudaimonia. And so Christians, speaking to virtue ethicists, should embrace the fact that we start on exactly the same foundation. There is a design and purpose to life, and lived rightly, life is fulfilling. And that design really exists in us, but it's not simply biology, and it's not psychology or neurology, it's theology. We are designed in the image of God, and God's fingerprints still exist on us. And when we live rightly, we live like God did when God came in the flesh. We imitate Jesus and live like Jesus. And that is a crossover between Christian theology and virtue ethics. Okay, let's talk about some criticisms of virtue ethics that can be leveled. Now, when it comes to Aristotelian ethics, there are three main criticisms that can be leveled against virtue ethics. And this is in the renaissance of virtue ethics in the 20th century, the criticisms have surfaced again. And whereas there was a moment 20, 30 years ago where virtue ethics were suddenly in a resurgence, I think they've died down now because these criticisms have been leveled again by thoughtful, articulate modern philosophers who have made it abundantly clear it's hard to discern anything substantial and objective that a virtue ethicist could say to recommend their ethical system to someone else. So, so here are the three criticisms of virtue ethics. First, virtue ethics rests on an anthropology that has been rejected, and it's an anthropology of design and causation. And so Aristotle, as he describes the human being, says that the human being is, like everything else, is a product of four causes. Everything has four causes. There's a material cause, which is the thing that something is made out of. So picture, for instance, a bronze statue. The statue is made out of bronze. That's the material cause. It is caused to exist by the existence of the bronze. Secondly, it has a formal cause, and that's the shape that it's going to be formed into. A statue in the shape of the thinker is in that particular shape. And so it is caused to be by its form, secondly. Thirdly, it has an efficient cause. And this is the one that's closest to what we think of when we say cause in modern English. The sculptor is the cause of the sculpture. He or she makes it come to be, the inventor or the creator of it. And that's the efficient cause. And then fourthly, there's the final cause, which is the ultimate goal. What the sculptor is trying to create is the goal. even in the mind of the sculptor, the final cause is that image or that vision of what it's to be. And Aristotle said that everything, including human beings, are made up of these four causes. Well, that in turn shapes his vision of a virtuous life, because our telos is a design of our final cause, what we are to be. And we then are made out of a certain material and take a certain shape. And you know, if you want to lean theological, which the Greeks did, it's in Aristotle's background a little bit. There is an efficient cause behind us, a God bringing us to be. All the same, that whole idea has been thrown to the wayside. So there's no longer any intended goal of the design. On Darwinian evolution, the process of natural selection goes this way. You have an existing thing that mutates by accident, and then the environment kills off mutations that cannot survive the environment. The mutation is not intentional. It's not brought about by a thoughtful mind trying to improve something. It's an accident. The environment has no mind of its own either. The environment doesn't choose to kill certain things and not others. It's just a toxic environment, right? The Earth's early atmosphere is filled with methane and carbon and some oxygen. It just killed things off. And so the mutation can actually cause the thing to die. But occasionally the mutation makes it more capable of surviving the environment. And though it's not driven by a desire to survive, and the environment is not motivated by a desire to kill it, and the mutations are not intentional attempts to survive, this process nonetheless creates a system in which things mutate, change, survive better, and last longer. None of that has any intentional design. There's no end game. There's no goal. And evolution is not progress. There is no way in which evolution is tied to progress. Because you can actually evolve to become something which we could say is morally worse than the thing that came before it, but that survives better. So for instance, cockroaches might be the best adapted to survive. So if everything else died, the cockroaches might still be around. That doesn't make them the best form of life. It just makes them adapted to survival. So it's a confusion to tie evolution and progress together. Those are not the same. Evolution should be tied to survival alone. And as a consequence, there's no design. There's no efficient cause shaping us to be. There's no God behind it. And there's no formal cause. There's no design in the end. There's no telos. And consequently, no eudaimonia that is to be achieved through fulfilling the telos. We are just an accident of time and space. So, the logos that John presumed can give us an efficient cause and a formal cause, but without God, it's all just kind of a joke. And so virtue ethics rests on this vision, this anthropology, this vision of humanity that depends on causes that in fact no one subscribes to anymore. So a lot of the foundation, the epistemology of Aristotle has fallen by the wayside in the wake of an evolutionary understanding of anthropology. A second big criticism that is leveled against virtue ethics is that it is immeasurable. It is impossible to discern exactly when someone is living virtuously and when they're not living virtuously. And again, the virtue ethicist would just say, do what virtuous people would do. Do the right thing the way a virtuous person would do it. And if you come to this place where you're living a happy, fulfilled, healthy, productive adult life, then you've reached eudaimonia. But in fact, that's completely immeasurable. If you come to a place in life where you're feeling generally content, you can't necessarily tie that to a process of virtue that's brought you there. And if anything, our contentment tends to wax and wane like the moon. So there are times where we feel content and other times where we don't. And at no point can we say the process of repeatedly acting virtuous throughout the course of my life has ultimately brought me to a place where I have sustained happiness, because that is not the nature of humanity. And there would be no way to measure and quantify that happiness anyway, to say, look, it worked. I've arrived. So whatever the virtue ethicists are proposing, there's no way to quantifiably measure it and assess it. Now that doesn't mean it's wrong, because something can be right or true and still be immeasurable. But the virtue ethicists are putting forth a claim against other ethical systems that says this ethical system is better or more correct. And to weigh the systems against one another, there needs to be some standard by which the process of life, of virtuous life, is measured. And virtue ethics cannot offer that. A third criticism that is often leveled of virtue ethics, and this one's kind of the Achilles heel, is it cannot solve ethical disputes. So when people get in a debate over abortion or euthanasia or capital punishment, whatever social issue you want to debate, virtue ethicists could actually disagree with one another, could actually say, well, I believe a virtuously lived life affirms the right of an unborn human being to have life. And another perfectly virtuous person could say, I believe ultimately the freedom of thought and decision should be left to an individual as a bestowing of dignity on that individual, and it is not the right of the state to take that privilege away from an individual woman. And both of those people could say, I'm operating from virtuous intentions. My thoughts and purposes are noble. In no way am I trying to skirt morality. I'm actually trying to live into the heart of morality. And that virtuous attempt leads me to this conclusion. And they can end up in different places. And virtue ethics cannot resolve the dispute. Virtue ethics has absolutely nothing to appeal to say, well, no, this one must be right and that one must be wrong, because we look at this standard which says that one particular value is greater than another. Now, a virtue ethicist would say in response, hold on, that's true of every ethical system. No ethical system can exist without debates from adherents. People in any ethical system end up in debates on certain issues, and the ethical systems that they subscribe to can't solve it. There are Christians who disagree on all kinds of things. The whole history of the Christian church is a series of splits. And a particularly arrogant Christian today might say, well, I was just always on the right side of the splits, and everybody who disagrees with me is just wrong. And if they only believe the Bible like I do, they might come around. But that ultimately is nothing but egoism. That's ego and hubris. And ultimately, any intelligent, thoughtful, wise Christian can see that Christians can actually disagree on even some moral issues, and that doesn't make them hypocritical in light of their doctrine. That simply says that Christian doctrine does not prescribe a solution to every ethical issue that comes along. Moral dilemmas really are dilemmas. They're two different good ethical values in conflict with one another, where it seems like we have to choose one or the other. And neither Christianity nor any other ethical system completely solves all of them. So the virtue ethicist could say, hey, that's not a fair complaint to level against virtue ethics. Sure, we cannot solve all disputes, but neither can any other ethical system. You could then push back and say, yeah, but virtue ethics is particularly bad at it. Because saying that we should simply appeal to a virtuous life really gives us nothing but vagaries on any particular moral issue of dispute. A virtue ethicist can't meaningfully take a side in abortion, or all virtue ethicists wouldn't take the same side in abortion, or euthanasia, or war, or capital punishment, or any other ethical issue. And this is actually a valid criticism. Virtue ethics is really impotent to solve conflicts. And at least on Kantianism, on the deontology of Immanuel Kant, certain things can be said to be wrong. And Kant is clear about this. He says it is wrong to lie in every circumstance, irregardless. You may never do that. And so you can't be a Kantian and say, well, so, okay, but sometimes it's okay to lie. Because Kant actually lays down moral guidelines that are inescapable. Even Christianity lays down some ethical guidelines which are indisputable. Jesus says, love your enemies, and he says it over and over and over again. Jesus says, do not love money, and he says over and over and over again. If a person says, well, I'm a Christian, but I also love money and I hate my enemies, you really aren't a Christian at that point. You're a hypocrite at that point. And so you really have to decide where you're going to land on that one. Because Jesus' ethics are, on certain issues, just black and white. That's true with a lot of or most of ethical systems, but not virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is not aimed at resolving disputes, and it has very little to offer in light of that. And so I think that is a valid, the third criticism of virtue ethics, I think is sustainable. I don't think virtue ethicists can ultimately respond to that. So that is a look at Aristotle and virtue ethics. I hope that is enlightening in broadening your sense of the history of ethics. I would be fascinated to know if any of you, after studying virtue ethics beyond the bounds of this lecture, actually came to decide that was the ethical system for you, and you were going to land on it and pursue it because you felt like it was the right way to go. Nonetheless, Aristotle does lay out for us the hope that life lived in a right way leads to a kind of maturity and fulfillment. And I think we all have that hope in one way or another. So that's another facet of our studies in ethics. I hope that I hope that widens your mind, and God bless the rest of your studies. I'll see you again soon.